They voted on a Thursday. That was the part that stayed with Maren Voss the longest. Not the cold of the November morning, not the faces of the elders arranged in a half-circle in the meeting hall, not even her mother's hands folded in her lap, refusing to reach for her. It was the fact that they voted. 7 men around the table, the community ledger open in front of Elder Braun, and they took a formal vote on whether a 13-year-old girl should be put outside the settlement walls before the first snow fell. The vote was 5-2. The 2 dissenters said nothing when it was over. The formal charge, the one Elder Braun read from the ledger in his careful German, was spreading false prophecy and disturbing the peace of the community. What Maren had done was tell anyone who would listen that the winter coming was not a regular winter. She had said it first in September, then again in October, then again at the harvest gathering when Elder Braun himself was present, which was when it stopped being a child's frightened talk and became a disruption requiring a formal response. What she had said was this: the coming winter would be longer than anything the Dakota settlement had seen. It would start before December, and it would not release until late March, possibly April. The families who had prepared for a regular winter would run short. There would be deaths. She had said it with the quiet certainty of someone reporting a fact rather than predicting the future, which was part of what frightened people. Children who made wild claims with bright eyes and dramatic gestures were one thing. A 13-year-old girl who stated catastrophe in the same tone she used to recite multiplication tables was something else. Elder Braun asked her, at the final meeting, to explain the basis of her prophecy. She told him. She had been watching the animals since July. The muskrats had built their lodges higher than she had ever seen, the mud walls thicker, the dome rising nearly 2 feet above the water surface rather than the typical 14 inches. The beavers at the creek bend had stored 3 times the usual quantity of branches under the water before August ended. The woolly bear caterpillars she collected each September for comparison had a black band covering 80% of their bodies, the widest she had measured in 4 years of keeping records. The geese had gone south 6 weeks earlier than the previous year. The bark on the north side of the cottonwood trees along the creek was thicker than she had measured in any prior autumn. She had records. She had kept them in a small notebook since she was 9, measurements and dates and observations, the kind of records a person kept when they were trying to understand something rather than trying to convince someone. Elder Braun looked at her notebook. He looked at her. He said, "These are natural signs. The Lord speaks through Scripture, not through caterpillars." She said, "The caterpillars don't know they are a sign. They are responding to what they can sense that we cannot. The winter is already decided. They know it before we do." She should not have said it quite that way. She understood this the moment the words were out, not because they were wrong, but because they were the kind of correct that a 13-year-old girl had no standing to be, with 5 of the 7 elders sitting in judgment. The vote was 5-2. Her mother's hands stayed in her lap. What followed was managed with the particular efficiency of a community that had rehearsed difficult decisions enough times to have a procedure for them. She was given until sunrise the following morning. She could take her personal belongings, her winter coat, her boots, and a share of food proportional to what her family's labor had contributed to the communal stores. Elder Braun calculated this at 11 pounds of dried corn, 4 pounds of salt pork, and a half-pound of salt. She could not take the mule. She could not take any tools that were designated as community property. Her mother came to her in the dark before sunrise. She embraced her and held her for a long time and said nothing, because there was nothing adequate to say, and she knew it. Her father had died in the river crossing 3 years before. Her mother had 2 younger children who needed the winter and the walls and the communal stores, and following Maren out the gate would have meant abandoning them to survive on what one woman alone could manage on the Dakota prairie in November. It was the arithmetic of 3 children against 2, and her mother had done the arithmetic. Maren walked east at first light with her coat and her boots and 11 pounds of corn and 4 pounds of salt pork and her notebook tucked into the inside pocket of her coat next to her chest. She walked for 2 hours before she stopped. She stopped at the creek, the one she had spent 4 autumns watching, counting caterpillars and measuring bark and learning the habits of the beavers who worked the bend where the current slowed. She knew this ground the way you knew ground you had given your full attention to over years. She stood at the bank and looked at the beaver dam and the muskrat lodges rising higher than they should, higher than any winter she had recorded, and she felt the particular feeling of being right about something that had cost you everything. She had until spring. That was the timeline in her head. Not the timeline Elder Braun had set, which was simply outside. Her timeline was the one she had been calculating since July. If she was right about the winter, which every measurement she had taken told her she was, then she had until the long cold broke in late March or April to survive it. Everything between now and then was the problem in front of her. She needed shelter. She needed it fast before the real cold arrived, and she needed to build it in a way that a 13-year-old girl, alone, with no tools beyond a knife and her bare hands, could actually accomplish. She looked at the creek bank. The creek had been cutting into the clay bluff on its eastern side for longer than the settlement had existed. The bluff face ran about 8 feet high at its tallest point, vertical clay over sandstone ledge. At the base, where the creek had undercut the softer clay layers, there were natural overhangs, shallow but real. She had sat under the deepest one in summer rainstorms. She had measured it at 6 feet of depth, 6 feet deep, 8 feet of bluff height above it. The natural compression of the sandstone ledge at the floor. She was not going to build a house. She was going to enlarge what the creek had already started. The work began that afternoon. With her knife and her hands, she drove the blade into the clay above the sandstone ledge at the back of the deepest overhang and pried. The clay was dense, slightly moist, cohesive. It came out in chunks the size of her palm. She pulled pieces down and threw them behind her and kept going. She dug for 3 days before she found a tool. Working along the sandstone ledge on the second day, she found a beaver cache wedged into a gap at the base of the bluff. 3 branches, each as thick as her wrist, stripped of bark and tapered to points by the beaver's teeth. She used them as digging sticks, driving the tapered ends into the clay above the ledge and prying downward, leveraging chunks loose that she pulled out by hand. The work was faster. Not fast, but faster. The first snow came on the 4th day, light, early, a warning, not an event. She had expected it. She was not ready, but she was less unready than she had been 4 days ago. By the end of the first week, the chamber measured 9 feet wide, 7 feet deep from the bluff face to the back wall, and 4 feet tall at the highest point. Not tall enough to stand. She could sit up, move on her knees, lie flat. She built a sleeping platform from the beaver branches, laid across 2 flat stones she carried from the creek bed, raising herself off the ground to stay out of the cold air that pooled at floor level. She packed dry grass and cattail down from the creek margins under and over the branch platform as insulation. The entrance was still open, which meant everything she had built in the walls and ceiling was working against a constant cold air exchange with the outside. She needed to seal it. The seal was the difference between a cave and a shelter. She built it in 2 stages. First, she lashed the largest beaver branches together into a frame, 9 feet wide and 4 feet tall, fitted to the opening she had shaped during the digging. She packed clay from the excavated spoil pile into the frame, pressing it into every gap. Then she packed insulation into the clay, cattail down and dry leaves, and dried grass pressed into the outer layer before she smoothed a final coating of wet clay over everything. The finished plug was a fitted clay and insulation barrier she could remove from inside by pulling the frame outward and replace by pushing it back into position. The weight of it when she tested it was more than she could easily lift, which was the most important property it had. Wind could not move what she could barely move herself. She went inside and pulled the plug into position and sat in the dark. 47 degrees. She could feel it without a thermometer, the way anyone who has spent enough time underground learns to feel the difference between deep earth cool and cold. 47 degrees is not warm. It is the temperature of things that are protected, of root cellars and deep wells, the temperature the earth maintained below the frost line, regardless of what happened above it. Outside in a Dakota territory, November night, the temperature was dropping towards zero. The differential was 47 degrees against zero. She had built herself a 50-degree advantage. She could survive 50 degrees of advantage. She built the fire system over the following week. An open fire inside the chamber was impossible. The smoke had nowhere to go, and the space was too small to absorb the carbon safely. What she could use was a heating stone, the same principle her grandmother had used in the old country before the immigration, before Dakota Territory, before everything. A flat stone heated in an outdoor fire carried inside, radiating its absorbed heat into the air for hours after the external fire was out. She built a small fire pit at the base of the bluff beside the entrance, sheltered from the wind by the bluff overhang and walled on 3 sides by creek stones. Each evening she built a small fire of dry willow from the creek bank and set 3 flat sandstone pieces into it. She had tested every stone before selecting them, heating each one alone to check for cracking under thermal stress, which indicated trapped moisture. Only dense, dry, uncracked sandstone passed the test. When the stones were fully heated, she carried them one at a time through the entrance plug, using 2 forked sticks, set them on the chamber floor, and resealed the entrance behind her. The stones radiated heat into the small space for 5 to 6 hours, raising the interior from 47 degrees to 64, sometimes warmer. She slept in the warmth and woke to 47 degrees when the stones had cooled, which was still survivable. Still, the Earth's 47-degree floor under everything. She burned 2 armloads of willow per evening fire, not one more. She was 13 years old and alone, and the fuel on the creek bank had to last until the long winter broke in April, which was the timeline she had recorded in her notebook, and which she trusted more than she trusted anything else at that point in her life. She spent daylight hours in the accumulation of tasks that kept her alive and kept her records current. She gathered willow and stacked it against the bluff. She improved the chamber floor with flat stones over the raw clay. She extended the clay packing over the bluff face above the chamber, building up the insulating mass between the roof of her space and the cold air above. She cut a ventilation gap into the top of the entrance frame, a 2-inch slot that allowed moist air to escape without letting enough cold air in to drop the temperature significantly. Without it, her own breath would have saturated the interior air, and the dampness would have undone everything the earth temperature was holding steady. She also kept her records. Every morning, she estimated the outside temperature from the creek's behavior. Ice at the still edges meant below 25 degrees. Ice reaching the main current meant below 10. Ice covering the full width meant at or below 0. She recorded the date, the temperature estimate, and her fuel inventory. And she recorded her observations about the sky, the wind direction, and the behavior of any animals she could see from the entrance. She was doing what she had always done. She was paying attention. December brought a mild week that might have convinced someone else they had been wrong. Temperatures rose to the 30s. The November snow softened at the edges. The creek ice thinned enough to hear the water moving under it. Maren did not feel vindicated by the mild week. She felt alarmed. She had seen this pattern in her 4 years of records. A false thaw in December following an early freeze was not winter relenting. It was energy accumulating. The muskrats and the beavers and the caterpillars had not prepared for an average winter. They had prepared for the worst possible winter, the winter they could sense in ways she was only beginning to decode. The false thaw was part of the pattern, not a contradiction of it. She used the mild week to work. She gathered 3 additional weeks of willow and stacked it against the bluff. She added a second insulating layer to the entrance plug, clay on the interior face as well as the exterior. She found a 4th heating stone at the creek bed that passed her cracking test, which meant she could heat 4 stones per evening instead of 3, increasing the heat output without increasing the fuel consumption. She improved the ventilation gap by adding a small deflector above it, a clay shelf that allowed air movement while blocking wind-driven cold from entering directly. She also thought about the settlement. She thought about it carefully, not with bitterness, which she had decided she could not afford, but with the same methodical attention she applied to everything else. 3 of the 43 people behind those walls were her family. Elder Braun had voted correctly according to his rules, and incorrectly according to what was actually true. The 2 no votes had said nothing when the vote concluded. When the long blizzard arrived, the settlement would have prepared for an ordinary winter, 4 months of ordinary cold, ordinary fuel, ordinary food. Not 5 or 6 months. Not the extended shortage she had predicted. She thought, I cannot help them from outside, not in any organized way, but I can be here. I can have more than I need and be here when the arithmetic stops working for them. She kept cutting willow, she kept stacking it, she kept writing in the notebook. The blizzard arrived on the 3rd of January. It came from the northwest at 3 in the afternoon, and the first sign Maren had was not wind or snow, but a kind of pressure in the air, a silence that was louder than sound, the quality of the atmosphere that changed when something large was deciding what to do next. She had been gathering wood at the creek when she felt it. She loaded her arms and ran. She was inside with the entrance plug sealed before the first real gust hit the bluff face. The bluff shook, not in any way that threatened the structure, but the wind pressure against the clay was audible as vibration running through the earth around her, a low pulse, steady and enormous. She sat with her knees pulled up and listened to what she had predicted and felt the temperature of the air against her face and understood, sitting in 47 degrees while the wind ran 60 miles per hour outside, precisely what the difference between right and wrong had cost her. She heated her stones that first evening through a fire that the wind tried to kill 6 times before it held. She shielded the fire pit with her body and a flat stone propped at an angle. The stones heated. She got them inside. She sealed the entrance and sat in the gathering warmth and listened to the blizzard dismantle everything above the frost line. The storm ran for 4 days. On the 2nd day, during a brief wind shift, she heard voices from the direction of the settlement. She could not make out words. She could make out the particular quality of urgency in sounds that did not need to be words to communicate distress. On the 3rd day, in a lull, she opened the plug and looked out. The prairie was a uniform white surface without feature. In the middle distance, she could see the settlement meeting hall roof, and from it a smoke column that was too thin. A fire working too hard against cold it was not designed for. She closed the plug and checked her fuel. 6 weeks remaining. Her food had perhaps 5 weeks. She was in better shape than she had been at any point since November. The people in the meeting hall were burning everything they had against a cold she had tried to warn them was coming. She thought for the rest of the 3rd day. She was 13 years old, and she had 11 pounds of corn and 6 weeks of carefully managed willow fuel, and a chamber in a creek bluff that was holding 47 degrees, while the world outside tried its best to go to 0. She thought about what she had and what they did not have, and whether those 2 facts could be connected in any way that helped. She thought, when the storm breaks, someone will come. When someone comes, I need to be ready to show them what I built fast enough that they can build it themselves before the next cold snap, which was coming, which she had recorded in October as a near certainty, a second severe stretch in late January after the first blizzard broke. She spent the last day of the storm doing one thing. She drew diagrams. In the notebook, with the charcoal stick she carried, she drew the cross-section of the chamber, the entrance seal, the ventilation gap, the heating stone system, the fire pit placement relative to the bluff overhang. She drew them clearly, with dimensions she knew from the work of her own hands, and she added notes about the things that mattered most, and the things that people would get wrong if she was not standing there watching them. She drew 5 copies of the most important diagram, the chamber depth relative to the frost line, because that was the principle that everything else depended on. Below the frost line, the earth held its temperature. Above it, the air won. The storm broke on the morning of the 7th, not completely, not for long, but the driving wind dropped enough that a person who needed to move could move. 3 men came from the settlement before midday. She recognized them from a distance, the way you recognized people you had grown up beside, from the way they moved rather than the way they looked. The man in front she recognized last, when he was close enough for his face to be clear. Elder Braun. She stood at the entrance to the chamber and watched them cross the drifted creek bottom and come up to her and stop. Braun looked at the bluff face. He looked at the entrance plug fitted into the excavated opening. He looked at the fuel stack she had dug out from under the snow that morning. He looked at her. He said, "The Voss family and the Zimmerman family have no fuel. 2 others are nearly out. The meeting hall fire went cold last night. We moved everyone to the Keller house, but they cannot hold against another cold snap, and the records say another severe week is coming." She said, "How many people?" He said, 43. She looked at her fuel stack. She did the arithmetic he was waiting for her to do. Then she said, "I have 6 weeks of heating fuel for myself. Not for 43, but I know this creek bottom. I can show you where the wood is." He said, "We need you to show us." She said, "I'll show you the wood, and I'll show you how to build what I built. If you want to survive the rest of this winter without another crisis, every family that can dig needs a chamber like this one. Not a house. A hole in the earth below the frost line. The earth is warmer than the air, and the air is going to stay cold until March." Braun looked at the chamber entrance. He said, "You built this yourself?" "Yes." He said, "In how long?" She said, "The chamber took 4 days. The entrance seal and the heating system took another week." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Show me." She took him inside and showed him everything. The clay walls, and the sandstone floor, and the entrance plug, and the heating stones still warm from the previous evening. The ventilation gap at the top of the frame and how it worked. The fuel storage position outside the entrance and why she had covered it with branches before the storm. The temperature difference between the chamber air and what he had walked through to get here, which he felt in his hands and his face when he came through the entrance. The same way anyone felt it, the body understanding before the mind was ready to. He read the notebook. He read the October entries, the ones where she had written the second severe cold snap as a near certainty in late January. He read the July entries with the muskrat measurements. He read the August entries with the beaver cache volume estimates. He read the September caterpillar band ratios. He set the notebook down and said, "You have been keeping these records since you were 9. She said, "Yes." He looked at the diagram she had drawn during the last day of the storm. He studied it, without speaking, for long enough that she knew he was understanding it, not simply looking at it. He said, "This is the frost line depth, yes. Below that depth, the ground stays at 47 degrees all winter. The cold above cannot reach it. You put your chamber below that line, and the earth does half your work." Braun looked at Werner Schilling, the second elder, the man who had voted no. Schilling had said nothing since they arrived. He was 60 years old and broad through the chest, and he had been watching Maren with the expression of someone who had been right about something in private for long enough that seeing it confirmed in public required a particular kind of stillness. Schilling said, "The ventilation gap. What happens if you make it too large?" She said, "The cold air enters faster than the warm air can replace it, and the interior temperature drops. The 2-inch width is the balance point for a space this size. Larger space needs a larger gap, smaller space needs less." Schilling said, "And the moisture," she said, "the moist air rises because it is warm and exits at the top. The incoming cold air enters at the bottom of the gap, where it deflects off the clay shelf and mixes before it reaches the sleeping area. Without the gap, your own breath builds up as condensation on the walls and eventually saturates the insulation in the entrance seal. The gap keeps the interior drier than the outside air." Schilling looked at Brown. Brown looked at Maren. He said, "We will need your help." She said, "I know. I've been ready since the storm started." She spent 3 days in the creek bottom after the blizzard broke, walking every section she had mapped over 4 years, pointing out every stand of willow, every accessible wood source, explaining the cutting approach that extracted the most burnable material from greenwood. The men who came with her were not young, and they were not soft, and they cut a great deal of willow in 3 days. It was not enough for 43 people through a Dakota winter, but it was enough to extend what they had. She also spent those 3 days showing 6 families how to build earth chambers, not into cliff faces because most of them did not have her specific geography, but into the low banks of the creek drainage where the ground rose even 4 or 5 feet. She walked each site and explained the depth requirement relative to the local frost line, which she knew from 4 years of digging and probing and recording. She explained the clay wall support, the entrance seal construction, the ventilation gap sizing, the heating stone selection. She drew the important diagram from the notebook for each family, the depth versus frost line drawing, the one that everything else depended on. Not every family built what she showed them. Some of the men were too proud, and some of the families were too established in their existing structures to believe that a hole in the earth was a better answer than the building they had put up with their own hands. This was a predictable response, and she did not fight it. She showed those who asked and moved on to the next. 3 families dug chambers in the week before the second cold snap arrived. They moved into them and burned a fraction of what the families in the frame structures consumed during the second severe week in late January, which ran 8 days and dropped the temperature to -29 on its worst night. When the second cold snap broke in early February, the families who had not built the chambers looked at the fuel remaining to the families who had and did the arithmetic in silence, which was the most honest response available. Elder Brown did not rescind the formal vote or make a public statement about the accuracy of the prediction. These were not things the settlement's formal structure easily accommodated, and Brown was not a man who worked well outside his formal structure. What he did was send Maren's mother to the chamber at the creek bluff on a Tuesday in February with a sack of dried beans and a piece of cured pork and a message. The message said the formal vote remained in the ledger, but the community recognized her contribution to the winter survival, and her presence in the settlement would be welcomed if she chose to return. Maren's mother stood at the entrance to the chamber and looked at what her daughter had built alone in November and kept alive through a blizzard and a second cold snap and said, "Come home." Maren said, "Tell me what the 2 younger ones need." Her mother said, "They need their sister." Maren said, "I'll come in spring. When the ground is workable, I can show the families how to build properly before next winter instead of during it." Her mother looked at her for a long time. She was 36 years old, and she had watched her daughter put outside the walls in November and had not followed her, and the cost of that calculation was something she would keep paying. She said, "You know what you are doing." Maren said, I have always known what I am doing. That was the problem. The spring came late, as the October records had predicted it would. The thaw arrived in patches, slow and muddy, the creek running high with snowmelt, the prairie emerging from under the white in sections of dark earth and dead grass. The settlement had made it through, not easily, not without suffering and exhaustion, and the February reckoning with what a winter you were not fully prepared for actually cost. But 43 people were alive in April who had been alive in November, which was not guaranteed to any frontier settlement that underestimated a Dakota winter. Maren returned in April. She walked the same creek path she had walked out in November and went to her mother's house and set her pack on the table, and her 2 younger siblings ran to her, and she held them without speaking for a long time. Elder Braun came that evening. He stood in the doorway and said, "We need to talk about the preparations for next winter." She said, "Sit down." He sat. She put the notebook on the table between them and opened it to the current page and the entry she had made that morning. The animals this spring were behaving in patterns consistent with a normal approaching winter, not an extreme one. She told him this. He said, "What does that mean for our work this summer?" She said, "It means we have until September to build what we should have built last summer. If the families dig their chambers in August, when the ground is soft and the weather is good, we will not spend another February like the one we just had. I need tools, real ones. And I need people who will dig in August when it is hot and uncomfortable instead of January when it is desperate." He looked at the notebook. He was a man who had been wrong and knew it. And the particular difficulty of that position was that the wrongness had happened publicly, and the record of it was in the community ledger in his own handwriting. He said, "I will organize the labor." She said, "And I need the ledger entry changed, not removed, changed. The charge of spreading false prophecy should be corrected to read observation of natural indicators and preparation advice. What I did was observation. Observation is not a charge." He was quiet for long enough that she knew the silence was real consideration rather than resistance. He said, "I will discuss it with the council." She said, "Talk to Elder Schilling first." He voted no. He has been right about this for 6 months, and he has not said so out loud, which is its own kind of patience. You owe him the first conversation. Brown understood exactly what she meant and was not certain how he felt about a 14-year-old reading the internal dynamics of his council with that kind of precision. He left and talked to Schilling and returned 3 days later and said the entry would be amended on the grounds of subsequent evidence. Schilling wrote the amendment himself because he had the neater hand. It read, "Original charge revised on grounds of subsequent natural evidence, confirmed by winter outcome. No further action required." He showed it to Maren before filing it. She read it. She said, "That is accurate." He said, "Is there anything missing?" She thought for a moment. She said, "Only the caterpillars, but they never need credit." He filed the ledger. She kept the notebook. The settlement at Crow Wing Creek built 7 earth chambers that summer and modified 12 existing structures using the principles she had built into the bluff that winter. She worked alongside families from June through September, teaching what she had taught herself in November under the pressure of having no alternatives: the frost line depth, the entrance seal, the ventilation gap ratio, the heating stone selection, the chamber proportions that let the earth do the most work for the least fuel. She continued her records. July through September of the following year showed normal animal patterns. Muskrat lodges at their standard height, beaver cache volumes ordinary, caterpillar bands at 45 to 50% black, which 4 years of comparison told her meant a hard but not extreme winter. She told the families in September that the coming cold would be standard, difficult but survivable without chambers if their structures were sound, much more comfortable with them. She was right. The winter of 1860, The Crow Wing Creek settlement burned 30% less fuel than it had burned in any previous winter, because 7 families were in earth chambers and 12 more were in improved structures holding heat they would previously have lost. The savings were real, and the arithmetic was simple, and she recorded it in the second notebook she had bought from the trading post in April, the one that followed the first. The first notebook, the one that had led to the vote, the one with the caterpillar measurements and the muskrat lodge heights and the bark thickness ratios and the 4 years of observation that Elder Braun had called false prophecy, she kept in the inner pocket of her coat for another 20 years. She kept it there because it was where it had been on the morning she walked out of the settlement at first light in November, and she had decided that it would stay there until she decided otherwise. She kept it there because it was the thing that had been right when everything around her was wrong, and she had learned in that winter what it cost to be right in a way that was unwelcome, and she had decided that the cost was worth it, and that the notebook in her pocket was the record of why. What Maren had done was not prophecy, though the word had followed her for years afterward in the settlement's storytelling, growing in the retelling the way stories grew when they had a good shape. It was not prophecy. It was attention. 4 years of careful, consistent, methodical attention to the natural world around her, recorded in a notebook by a girl who had understood from the time she was 9 years old that the natural world was always communicating and that most people had simply stopped listening. The muskrats were not sending a message. The beavers were not predicting the future. The caterpillars were not prophets. They were all simply responding to conditions that a sufficiently attentive observer could also detect: the atmospheric pressure patterns, the soil temperature signals, the subtle shifts in forage availability that preceded severe winters, the accumulated information that the natural world processed in real time and responded to with the urgency of survival. Maren had watched them respond. She had measured the responses. She had drawn conclusions from the measurements, and she had been correct, and the community had called the conclusions prophecy and voted 5-2, and she had gone out and built a hole in a creek bluff and survived to be right in January when the accounting finally happened. The principle she had used to survive the winter was not different from the principle she had used to predict it. Find the stable thing. Below the frost line, the earth stayed at 47 degrees regardless of what the air above was doing. The stable thing was always there. You had to know where to look and how deep to go. In the notebook, she had records going back to when she was 9. In the bluff, she had a chamber that held 47 degrees, regardless of what January was delivering outside. Both of them came from the same practice, the practice of finding what was steady and building on it rather than fighting what was unstable and losing. Elder Schilling, who had voted no and said nothing when the vote concluded and then written the amended ledger entry in April, said to her once, in the summer of 1859, when she was teaching his family the chamber construction, "I have wanted to ask you something since November." She was smoothing clay into the frame of the entrance seal. She said, "Ask." He said, "Were you afraid?" She was quiet for a moment. She pressed the clay flat with her palm and checked the seal line at the top. Then she said, "In November before the storm?" "Yes." He said, "Not of the cold?" She said, "Of being wrong. I had told them it was coming, and they had voted, and I had walked out with my corn and my salt pork and my notebook, and until the storm arrived, there was a chance that all of it had been wrong. The caterpillars, the muskrats, 4 years of records. There was a chance all of it was wrong, and I was just a 13-year-old girl who frightened the elders with talk she had no standing to be making." He said, "But you were not wrong." She said, "No, but you only know that afterward. While you are waiting to find out, all you have is the record and the method and the decision you made about whether to trust them." Schilling thought about this for a moment. He said, "And you trusted them?" She said, The muskrats trusted them. The beavers trusted them. They had been building for a worse winter than anyone in the settlement was prepared to admit since August. I watched them for 4 years, and they had never been wrong. If they were wrong about the caterpillars, I was willing to be wrong with them. Schilling looked at the entrance seal she had built. He looked at the chamber behind it, cool and dry and steady at 47 degrees in the middle of a July afternoon. He said, "The caterpillars were not wrong." She said, "No." He said nothing further. He went back to laying the gravel floor of his chamber extension, and she went back to the claywork, and neither of them said anything else about November, because November had been settled in January, and January had been settled in April, and the ledger reflected what it reflected. The chamber in the creek bluff stood for 11 years after that winter. Maren's younger brother used it as a root cellar after the family built a proper house in 1863. When he dismantled it in 1869 to extend the family garden, the clay walls were as solid as the day she had packed them with her hands. The sandstone floor was unchanged. The entrance frame, built from beaver cash branches and willow poles, had weathered but held. 13 years of Dakota Territory winters, and the thing a 13-year-old girl had built with a knife and digging sticks in November had outlasted its necessity by a decade. The notebook she carried in her coat pocket is in the South Dakota State Historical Society. The measurements in it are still legible. The dates are precise. The black band ratios for the woolly bear caterpillars are consistent with what modern research has documented as a correlation between caterpillar band width and winter severity. A correlation that science is still debating, but that a 9-year-old girl on the Dakota frontier took seriously enough to measure every September from 1854 onward. She was right. She had been right from the first entry. She was 9 years old when she wrote it, sitting in the grass by the creek with the caterpillar in one hand and a stick of charcoal in the other, writing down what she saw because it seemed like the kind of thing that mattered, and nobody else appeared to be writing it down. That was all. She looked at the world carefully, and she wrote down what she saw, and she trusted the record when it told her something that the people around her were not ready to hear. And when they put her outside the walls for it, she went to the creek and found the stable thing and built herself 47 degrees of shelter in the side of a clay bluff, and waited. 47 degrees. The Earth's own temperature held steady below the line where the cold could reach. She built it with her hands, and it held. If this story changed how you think about what careful attention is worth, and what a community loses when it silences the person paying the most careful attention to the things that matter, hit that like button right now and subscribe to this channel. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from, and tell me this. Have you ever observed something in the natural world that told you what was coming before it came? Because this audience knows how to read the land in ways that most people have forgotten. Leave your answer below. I read every single comment. The creek still runs along the eastern edge of what was the Crow Wing Creek settlement. The bluff is still there, lower than it was in 1858 because 160 years of erosion have continued the work the creek was doing when Maren found the overhang and decided it was enough to start with. The specific location of the chamber is gone, buried in the reshaping of the bank, but the frost line is still at the same depth it was in November of 1858. The earth below it still holds its temperature regardless of what the Dakota winter is doing above. The muskrats still build their lodges at heights that correlate with the severity of the approaching winter. The caterpillars still carry the information in the width of their black bands, patient and consistent every September, waiting for someone to measure them. They have always been waiting. They do not require credit. They only require attention. She paid attention. The winter of 1858 was recorded in the Dakota Territory Land Office records as one of the most severe on record for the region, with temperatures reaching sustained lows not seen again in the settlement area for 14 years. 3 settlements within 50 miles of Crow Wing Creek suffered casualties from cold and fuel exhaustion during the January blizzard and the subsequent late January cold snap. The Crow Wing Creek settlement suffered none, a fact that the community attributed publicly to the good management of their stores and the construction innovations they had implemented during the crisis, and attributed privately, in the conversations that happened around tables and at the trading post, to a 13-year-old girl who had tried to warn them and been put outside the walls for it. Maren never left the Crow Wing Creek area. This was a choice she made in April of 1859 when she returned from the bluff, and she made it not from obligation or from the absence of alternatives, but because she understood something that most people only understood after leaving. The ground she had spent 4 years learning to read was a specific ground. The creek and the bluff and the muskrat lodges and the beaver dam and the cottonwood bark and the caterpillars that came every September, these were the particular natural world she had built her knowledge on, and the knowledge was not portable in the way that most knowledge was portable. It was rooted in this place, in the specific depth of this frost line, in the specific behavior of these animals responding to these atmospheric patterns over this terrain. She had watched this place for 4 years, and the watching had saved her life and the lives of 43 other people. Leaving it would have meant starting over, which she could have done and might have done well, but which seemed like a waste of the most useful thing she had, which was 4 years of accumulated specific knowledge about a place that needed people who understood it. She stayed. She kept her records. She taught what she had learned to the children of the settlement with the same patient, methodical attention she had given to the caterpillars, because she understood that the knowledge would only survive if someone else learned to collect it. And the someone else who would be most likely to collect it well was a 9-year-old who thought measurements were interesting and had not yet been told that what they were measuring was not important. She found 3 such children in the settlement over the years. She gave each of them a notebook and showed them what to measure and when to measure it, and she checked their measurements against her own each autumn and showed them where they had seen correctly and where they had missed something and why the missing mattered. She did not tell them they were being trained in anything. She told them they were paying attention, which was true and which was the whole of the practice. The settlement's records show that over the 12 winters from 1859 to 1871, the Crow Wing Creek community never again suffered a winter crisis of the kind that had driven elder brawn across the frozen creek bottom to knock on a clay-sealed entrance in a bluff face. They had chambers and improved structures and a practice of monitoring the natural indicators each summer and comparing them against the previous year's records. They had people who knew what they were looking at when they looked at a muskrat lodge in August, and who understood what it meant and what it required of them. This was not a small thing. On the Dakota frontier, knowing what a winter required before the winter arrived was the difference between managing and suffering, between adequate fuel and exhausted fuel, between the anxiety of February arithmetic and the steadiness of February confidence. The families who had it worked differently than the families who did not. They prepared earlier, they built better. They slept through more nights without getting up to feed a fire that was fighting a battle it should not have needed to fight. All of this traced back to one source: a 9-year-old girl by a creek with a charcoal stick and a notebook, writing down what she saw because it seemed like the kind of thing that mattered, and it had. It had mattered more than anything else in the settlement that winter, more than Elder Braun's formal charge, more than the 5-2 vote, more than 11 pounds of dried corn and 4 pounds of salt pork and a ½ pound of salt. It had mattered in the way that true things mattered, not because anyone had agreed they were true, but because the winter arrived and the record was right, and the bluff held 47 degrees and 43 people were alive in April. That was the accounting. That was always the accounting on the frontier. The caterpillars did not know they were providing it. They never needed to know. They only needed to be measured by someone patient enough to measure them and honest enough to report what the measurement said, even when the reporting cost everything. She was honest. She was patient. She was 13 years old, and she built her knowledge into the earth itself and waited for the winter to confirm it. The winter confirmed it.